Hello, good afternoon. Thank you for joining. I'm Rakia Ramsey, Director of Policy and Advocacy here at Truman National Security Project. I see you all loading in, so we'll just give it a few seconds to allow everybody to join us. And thank you for taking time in your afternoon. This should be a really interesting discussion. I'm really excited about it. Our panelists here are cream of the crop, I think, when it comes to this issue. Both activists in working and doing the work, but you'll hear more about that later in their intros. So without further ado, and without wasting any more of your precious time on a Saturday, I'll go ahead and kick it over to our welcome, Mo Kalani, who is co-director of our Truman Seattle chapter. Take it away, Mo.
Hey, everyone. Hey, thanks, Rakia. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us on a Saturday. Mo Kalani, chapter director for the Seattle chapter of the Truman National Security Project. As many of you know, Truman is a nationwide membership organization of diverse leaders inspired to serve in the aftermath of 9/11, and we are committed to shaping and advocating for smart national security solutions. We are united in the belief that America is strongest when we stand with our allies to lead, support, and defend a growing global community of free people and just societies. We're composed of more than 1,700 post-9/11 veterans, frontline civilians, policy experts, and political professionals who share a common vision of U.S. leadership. We have 16 chapters across 47 states. We believe that America is at its best when we use all of our tools in our toolbox: diplomacy, defense, development, and democracy promotion. Today, we are very excited to have, as Rakia mentioned, an all-star cast of experts. First and foremost, we're joined by Congressman Adam Smith, chairman of the House Armed Services Committee, and Congressman of Washington State's 9th Congressional District. Thank you for joining us today, Congressman Smith.
Thank you.
We also have Amy Spitelnik, Executive Director of Integrity First for America, the civil rights nonprofit suing the neo-Nazis and white supremacists responsible for the violence in Charlottesville and the murder of Heather Heyer. We also are joined by Dr. Mohammed Fraser Rahim, the Executive Director of Quilliam International, the world's first counter-extremism organization, and author of a new book entitled America's Other Muslims. We're also very lucky to be joined by Mike Signer, former mayor of Charlottesville, Virginia, during the violent 2017 Unite the Right rally, and author of a new book called Cry Havoc: Charlottesville and American Democracy Under Siege. And finally, with my co-host today, Ryan Greer, and moderator, co-chair of the Truman Homeland Security and Community Resilience Expert Group, and director for program and strategy at the Anti-Defamation League. With that, I'll hand it over to Ryan.
Thanks, Mo. We have a wonderful set of panelists here for today. I'm going to ask Congressman Smith to give his opening statement, and then for the others, I just want to mention we are approaching the 3rd anniversary of the tragic attack in Charlottesville that took Heather Heyer's life, and the panelists that you have before you today are the tip of the spear trying to prevent that movement from taking more lives, and to counter its adherence and to drain it of its resources. So I can't wait to hear from our panelists. I want to thank the Truman Seattle chapter and Mo, and Truman headquarters, Rakia, and others. And then I just want to say, Congressman Smith, thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate you having you here. Congressman, take it away.
Well, thank you. And I pray this is an incredibly important topic. And I've worked with the Truman Project on a number of different, you guys do terrific work. I think you're focusing on the right issues in the right way. And I always enjoy working with you and appreciate those efforts. And I think this topic is important. And the way I would sum it up is it's sort of the rise of extremism in the US and the world. And I think that is the sort of the comprehensive way to look at it. Now, the particular extremism that we're talking about here is white supremacy and right-wing extremism. I just plant the idea in your head that extremism is not limited just to those ideological groups. Now, focusing on them is incredibly important. Even as we see, the protests across the country right now, we've heard a lot about Antifa. But what's really happening is a lot of right-wing groups, this Boogaloo group that has targeted and killed police officers, they are taking advantage of the protests to sow violence and disruption in accordance with the same ideology that brought them to Charlottesville. And we need to recognize the rise of that extremism. We've done some work in the Armed Services Committee. We have provisions in our bill this year, the National Defense Authorizing Act, to appoint a special inspector general to look at diversity issues, target extremism, and specifically look at the rise of white supremacy. because there have been a number of very disturbing incidents of white supremacy showing up within the ranks of our military, and we need to confront that. But your panelists are much more expert on the specifics of this. I just want to leave you with one thought about extremism. There's a lot of different things that sort of push extremism forward, but one of the big ones is a fundamental desire to tear down all existing institutions. And I think this is something that we need to collectively think about in a more comprehensive way. I think depending on where you're at in the political spectrum, you quickly identify white supremacist right-wing extremism, or you identify left-wing extremism, and you're like, it's bad, that's wrong, that's terrible. But what is motivating the rise in extremism writ large? I think that the single motivation is a growing opinion that somehow the world is fundamentally messed up, and every institution that we've lived and relied on for decades, is suspect. Either suspect or in some cases just tear the damn thing down. I don't care what comes next. It's awful, it's terrible, it's horrendous. We have to rip everything up and start over. That, I think we need to do a better job of combating. For as bad as things are, chaos is not better, in my view. And in your introduction there, Mo mentioned, the importance of international institutions. Whatever you may think about the limitations on where we're at as a country and as a world in 2020, the institutions that we built post-World War II, I 100% believe built a better world. Think about what led up to it. We had basically centuries of wars culminating in World War I and World War II, which combined to kill north of, somewhere in the neighborhood of 100 million people and basically blow the entire industrialized world off the face of the map. Far better that we have ways to resolve our conflicts without going to that extreme. And I think we need to stand up more forcefully for institutions, for alliances, for peaceful ways to settle our difference. Dick Gephardt always had a great way of putting this when he talked about how politics is a substitute for violence. What he meant was, we're going to resolve our differences. We have differences. My gosh, in my neighborhood, I have a neighborhood association, as I'm sure many of you do. It's like, who's the guy parking his truck in the street when he's not supposed to? Yeah, and everyone goes crazy, all right? You need a method to resolve that, short of physically attacking each other. That would be our institutions. We're wrestling with this in Seattle right now. I am 100% in favor of police reform. And I could go off on a very long jag about how we train our police officers in the totally wrong way that inevitably leads to the conflict that we have. But we got people showing up at the mayor's house, throwing stuff at it, and the police chief's house. That ain't helping anything. And it's because people think that institutions are irrelevant. They're terrible, they're evil, they're awful, they're racist, they're white, they're whatever. We have got to rebuild faith and support in our institutions, and while at the same time looking at white supremacist movements and right-wing extremism, which is deadly dangerous all across the world. So we got a lot of work to do, and I look forward to working with all of you to try to make that better.
Thank you so much, Congressman. Really appreciate that. We will come back to you with questions in a minute, but we'd like to welcome opening statements from our other panelists. Let's start with Amy Spitanik, who is the Executive Director of Integrity First for America. Amy, take it away.
Thanks so much, and thank you so much, Congressman, for being here. And I think what you just said is exactly right in so many ways, is what brought so many of those extremists to Charlottesville 3 years ago, that hate the ways in which institutions have been undermined through conspiracy theories and otherwise. And so what's so important for us to understand is that Charlottesville was a flashpoint rather than an isolated incident in the rise of extremist violence in the United States. And unfortunately, it's really served as a harbinger of what we've seen ever since. So many of the same tools and tactics that we saw 3 years ago in Charlottesville are being used now to try to distract from the Black Lives Matter protests, undermine them, and more broadly, have truly fueled a cycle of white supremacist and other far-right extremist violence from Pittsburgh to Christchurch to Poway to El Paso, which we just marked the 1-year anniversary of earlier this week, and beyond. And so it's so important to understand the role that Charlottesville played in this cycle, serving as that flashpoint, serving as that preview of these sorts of tools and tactics. And one of the central ways to understand that is to know that what happened there wasn't an accident. Rather, the violence in Charlottesville was planned for months in advance by the leaders and hate groups at the center of this movement. It was done on social media, on platforms like Discord, which is typically used by video gamers. And in those chats, they talked about every last detail in advance, from what to wear, what to bring for lunch, to which weapons to carry, to whether they could hit protesters with cars, and then claim self-defense, which is, of course, exactly what they did 3 years ago, killing Heather Ayer, injuring many others, including a number of our plaintiffs who were grievously injured in both the car attack and the tiki torch violence the night before. And so on behalf of a coalition of Charlottesville community members who were injured in that violence, we are bringing to court the 24 neo-Nazis, white supremacists, and hate groups responsible for what happened. This is not a speech case, this is a conspiracy case. We are suing them under something called the Ku Klux Klan Act of 1871. It is almost exactly what it sounds like, a statute first created to protect recently freed slaves from Klan vigilante violence in the South nearly 150 years ago. It's been used a number of times since to protect those whose civil rights were violated, one of the few private rights of recourse citizens have as opposed to recourse against the government. This is a right of recourse against private citizens who undermine their civil rights. Our defendants are truly a who's who of this movement: Richard Spencer, Chris Cantwell, Matthew Heimbach, Identity Europa, Vanguard America, League of the South, National Socialist Movement. I could go on, and I suspect many of these names are familiar to people who are doing work in this space, and many of you who just have unfortunately heard them crop up in the news over recent years. And we believe that this case is so important for so many reasons, but I will wrap up by just making clear sort of the three key outcomes we hope to see here. Of course, first and foremost, this is about accountability and justice. Justice for our plaintiffs who were so grievously injured 3 years ago, accountability for the 24 leaders and groups who orchestrated the violence and who have seen very little accountability from any level of government when it comes to what they planned and what they actually did. But this case also has the potential to set a very clear legal precedent that if you are part of this racist, violent conspiracy, if you're part of a racist, violent conspiracy like this, you will face very real consequences. You will be held accountable for your actions. And finally, this case truly has the potential to bankrupt and dismantle the groups and the leaders that are at the center of this violent movement. We're already seeing that firsthand, where you have neo-Nazis like Richard Spencer complaining in court that this case has financially crippled him. Others have said that they can't open new headquarters. The court has issued tens of thousands of dollars in sanctions against the defendants and even thrown one in jail for contempt of court. We are going to trial this October 26th in Charlottesville. And when we put the leaders of this movement on the stand, hold them accountable for the violence that they orchestrated 3 years ago, and win large civil judgments against them, it will make crystal clear that you can't orchestrate a racist, violent conspiracy in America and expect to get away from it. So we are so proud to support our brave plaintiffs, particularly as we mark the 3rd anniversary of Charlottesville. I'm grateful to Truman for bringing this extraordinary panel together, to the Congressman again for your leadership on these issues, and I'll pass it back to you, Ryan.
Thanks so much, Amy, and thank you for everything you are doing. You're having such a tremendous impact, and we're all rooting for you in your case. I want to turn to Dr. Mohammed Fraser Rahim. He has a wonderful new book out. I hope he has the opportunity to mention. He's also the head of the Quilliam Foundation North America branch. Mohammed, take it away.
There you go. Thanks, Truman, for having me. And I'm a Truman member as well, so it's nice to be amongst friends, congressmen, co-panelists. It's great to be with you all. What I would say, actually, I'll start off where I am. I'm actually in a hotel because yesterday, because of the hard work, we have individuals who are being released. And so how do you deal with individuals who are former ISIS members, former Al-Qaeda, and former white supremacists, black supremacists, and how do you work with them? This is the work that we do. On top of the policy analysis, on top of the books that we put out, you have to come up with a coordinated effort in the United States, which is still something that has to be unpacked at a very state, local, and federal level, of how do you reintegrate individuals back into society? How do you work with them while they're in prison? and how do you find real practical efforts? It's the same efforts that we've been trying to engage in dealing with gang intervention. It's the same issues that we've been trying to dealing with individuals who are former drug offenders. And so what I would tell you is that our work, and having been in government, worked in the intelligence community for over a decade, is that this work is still front and center, and we are still dealing with it. It's not always rosy, it's not always sexy, but it's something that we're engaged in. So I happen to, the person didn't get out in time, and so I had to stay overnight in a hotel. And that's unfortunately the work that even the executive director and the staff members that we have to roll up our sleeves. And so what I would say to you all, particularly as it relates to this topic, whether it is dealing with Islamists, which historically our organization, starting in the United Kingdom, was established by former extremists themselves, who made the slow journey in and out of extremism and have worked this problem set well over a decade. I would have never thought that myself, coming out of government, working in the intelligence community, would merge with these individuals. But that is the reality, and that experience has been able to bring incredible amount of insights and data points to help come up with tailored programs. And so for collectively, what we have been doing is trying to find those good formulas that have worked to prevent, as the congressman said so eloquently, against Islamism, that we did, or I should say, all forms of extremism, historically dealing with Islamist threat, but now we are dealing with white supremacists, we're dealing with Black supremacists, we're dealing with the full spectrum. And I think that that's a very fair, balanced approach into looking for tangible solutions, not just for the short term, for the long term. The last thing I'll say to you, because I can oftentimes be long-winded and I'll cut this short, is that for us, and particularly this new book that I have out, is there are incredible amount of formulas, incredible amount of models that are out there that can be effective. The particular book that I looked at was dealing with particularly African-American Muslims who were traditionally, historically coming from the enslaved African period, and then many who joined Islamic hybrid movements like the Nation of Islam, which certainly we know their rhetoric, and Louis Farrakhan, who's certainly brought it alive with his anti-Semitism. But on top of that, we know about him, but there was a movement from the late Elijah Muhammad and his son who branched out in 1975, who went another direction. And his son said, listen, we can no longer support this Black separatism. We can no longer support this divisive thinking and teachings, and we need to embrace American values and being Muslim on their own terms. And I think that that's an incredible amount of an example amongst many other examples of how we can effectively look at tools of integration, ways in which individuals can get past real and or perceived grievances and find compelling alternatives away down the pathway of extremism and look for ways in which we can find holistic communities. And so this is in a nutshell what the book capitalized, or what the book sort of offers. And I can tell you the work that we're doing, working with the full spectrum of extremism, those gems are certainly important as we try to work on these topics. The last thing I'll say to you all is that unfortunately, the fact that we've seen, according to FBI and certainly ADL, incredible amount of work that's been done on this. We have seen the white supremacist movement, or I should say broadly, individuals who have been radicalized and mobilized in this pathway. And in my hometown, where I also teach on faculty at the Citadel in Charleston, South Carolina, we know just in June of 2015, we saw Dylan Roof carry out that heinous attack against friends of family members who were brutalized. We have to see this as not just a single Democratic issue or Republican issue, but this is a bipartisan issue which we must work across the aisle. And I think if we think about it in this fashion, as a public safety matter, something which we have to build our communities strong and develop resilient communities, I think then we can look for long-term solutions. Thank you.
Thanks, Mohammed, and thank you for everything you're doing, and I hope you're staying safe down there. We'll come back to you in a minute. I want to, we have another, great, we have another best-selling author of Cry Havoc, Charlottesville, and American Democracy Under Siege. But before he was an author of that book, he was mayor of Charlottesville for, 3 years ago when the tragic attack happened, and led that city through its tragedy and through its resilience. So Mike, why don't you, Mayor Mike Signer, why don't you offer your opening statement?
Well, thanks, Ryan. It's really great to be with this very illustrious panel. I go back to the very beginning of Truman. I was in the first class of principals back in 2005, in that year that Mo was talking about. So it's been really exciting to see this community grow and become so influential and I think impactful continuing now. I was really grateful to the congressman for bringing up this idea of democratic resilience right at the beginning. I could not agree more that the stakes of what we're dealing with right now go to basically the integrity of our democratic institutions themselves, because that is the sorts of attacks that we're seeing. And I thought where I could speak on this topic of white nationalism as it goes to that topic is from the experience in the seat that I had of being mayor of the city under this kind of siege in real time. And I'm sort of cribbing from this book. So if you're interested in getting a deeper take on all this, the book, as Ryan mentioned, is called Cry Havoc, Charlottesville and American Democracy Under Siege. What happened in Charlottesville was you had 3 white nationalist events happen in 2017, a lot in parallel to Portland and Berkeley also being under siege in that same year, under multiple white nationalist attacks, where also anti-fascist activists were coming to openly conflict violently with those groups, with police, and the white nationalists were seeking to conflict with anybody and bait people into conflicts with them. At the Unite the Right rally was the 3rd of these that happened this year. Richard Spencer had come and created a group of about 100 with tiki torches at the Robert E. Lee statue in May. And then in July, a group of the Ku Klux Klan came, and there was a massive conflict then. And all of these, Charlottesville has really come to be like a canary in the coal mine of democracy under siege, an earlier stage, a microcosm, whatever metaphor you want to use. The Unite the Right rally consisted of over 10 organized paramilitary groups, like Amy said, that really were structured as militias. They had command structures, they were armed with organized assault rifles, they went on sorties in the neighborhoods, they offloaded on buses, they came to town from all over the country to invade the city, and it was an organized terroristic kind of activity. I wanted to, and then they were conflicted with by not as well organized, but there were far left groups that were extremists that were organized for conflict and are anti-government as well. Not nearly as dangerous, I don't think, as the organized white nationalist terrorist groups, but the brew and what we saw was really frightening and very violent. I wanted to talk a little bit just about what it presented for government, because the book is titled Cry Havoc for a reason. It really was havoc at the federal and state and local levels. At the local level, you saw we're a city of 50,000 people, and you're seeing this all around the country right now. When you have organized conflict between groups that are anti-government, it really brings government to its knees. The local government was totally overwhelmed. There were dozens of mistakes made by the local police that we kind of cataloged afterward. In our former government, the city manager runs the police, so I learned about a lot of this stuff as the public did. The state police made a ton of mistakes, and then when you back up to the federal government, it took months later of investigations to understand just why had the FBI and Department of Justice and the Department of Homeland Security not intervened and disrupted these potential terrorist groups in the same way that they would other terrorist groups. The theme here being that if you're going to achieve democratic resilience against organized, hostile, anarchist, anti-government extremist forces across the spectrum in a time of incredible disruption, you need to be proactive to achieve resilience. And the reason that afterward we started, I worked with the ADLs, that's Ryan and I know each other through there, and a whole host of a coalition of groups, including the Charles Koch Institute, the Fetzer Institute, to start a coalition called Communities Overcoming Extremism that convened 2 national summits. Amy was at one of them, that tried to harness collective learning around how do you shift to a proactive posture? What are best practices for dealing with this time of extremism? We derived a framework of sorts, which is that any community dealing with extremists has to have a hard and a soft side to their policy tools. The hard side are things like we're talking about here. It's increased prosecution, investigation, using the rule of law, better security plans that'll separate these groups, more intelligent application of the First Amendment, which is changing as we speak. Soft, I think, goes to some of what Muhammad is saying. You really do need to engage a wide range of actors in the civil society, community service officers and police, universities, the media, to have strategies before, during, and after events to reach out to the marginalized population so that they're not radicalized or victimized. And you really need to be thoughtful about that, because these are overwhelming events. And what has been so powerful to watch just in the last 2 or 3 months has been, I was on a call earlier this week with about 25 other mayors, most of them sitting. And what the congressman just talked about is exactly what's happening. A majority of them in these cities have had protests and vandalism at their houses. They have young kids. These are, what I experienced was unbelievable levels of heckling, takeovers of city government. I was a Jewish public official, and the anti-Semitic attacks and trolling and harassment targeted toward me were astounding. But they really were, unfortunately, the rule and not the exception now, from what I was hearing this week. And I just wanted to call out 2 work products so that everybody has reference to them in this group. The first was the final report of the Communities Overcoming Extremism project, which is at overcomingextremism.org. It was the result of these summits, and it highlights case studies like Amy's work. I wanted to point to one intervention that we did, which was joining with Georgetown University's Institute for Constitutional Advocacy and Protection to sue the militia groups that invaded Charlottesville using a 200-year-old provision in Virginia's Constitution that makes unpermitted militia groups illegal, basically. Never needed to use these laws before because you've never seen this kind of threat to the state in the last couple 100 years, but now you're starting to see this, and it worked. It yielded binding consent decrees with these groups to ensure that they would not invade the city again. And now it's been used in Dayton, Ohio, Albuquerque. We just did an event last week. The attorney, the prosecutor there is using this tactic to sue the white nationalist militia that has invaded there to prevent them from doing this again. And Georgetown, ICAP at Georgetown, they just released last week an incredibly detailed toolkit for municipalities to use in planning for dealing with political violence and extremist events that really walks through, it's got like 400 footnotes, and it walks through the very apertures that cripple local governments when they're trying to deal with this organized kind of violence right now, which is like, how do you do time, place, manner restrictions that won't get you overruled in court? How do you construct a security plan that really works with all your best stakeholders? How should police conduct themselves? What will be upheld? What's the best practice? And a lot of this, when you're looking at these kind of soft communities or vulnerable ones, they don't know. We don't have enough best practices because this threat is so new, fast, and dangerous. And also a lot of these actors, as Amy said, are very canny and very strategic and very crafty, and they'll use platforms like Discord to plan their violence. So there is learning, and I think that it goes ultimately to just what the congressman said, which is we need to be proactive and creative in adapting our democratic norms and institutions to this new homegrown threat, and we need to do it together. And it's very daunting, frightening work because it's harrowing when you're in public office right now. And I know that, and I heard that this week from these mayors who are having, protests at their house. But that means, unfortunately, that it's even more important to get good people into office with shifting our democracy to a forward footing against this threat. So I'll close. Thank you again for having me in this panel, and I'm really looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you so much, Mike. I want to pick up on one of those concepts. You mentioned the need to be proactive. And I observed that Amy mentioned new technology that's being used to coordinate, encrypted technology or otherwise, to coordinate some of these attacks. And the congressman mentioned the boogaloo movements. We have new movements, new technology, and yet we need to get ahead of it. So my question, which is for all of the panelists, I'm going to start with the congressman. What are the trends that you're seeing? If we're going to be proactive, we have to see the trends. What are the trends that you're seeing that worry you? What are the trends that you're seeing that make you, hopeful, or both or neither? So, Congressman Smith, what are the trends that you're thinking about?
Well, 2 trends worry me. As for what makes me hopeful, I think the primary thing that makes me hopeful is I'm just overall an optimist about the human race. I can't point to a specific thing, but the arc of history and all that good stuff. But by and large, I do believe that we can figure things out, and I've seen human beings, solve problems that you would have thought unsolvable. With the Republic has survived worse is always the line that I use, and that's true. But the two troubling trends are, well, Amy and Mike described it much better than I do, is the way people are using modern technology to just like exacerbate extremism. I mean, just to take it and blow it through the ceiling. I remember 15 years ago, I was in Silicon Valley meeting with the folks at Facebook. I'm not a huge fan. And, you know, and they were, oh, you know, this new, we're going to do all these wonderful, we're going to bring people together. And at the end of the day, that was kind of all bullshit. Basically, they were all going to make a lot of money. And that was the main thing that they were excited about. And that's fine. I'm a capitalist, not opposed to it, but don't bullshit yourself about what you're truly accomplishing here. Don't think that you're like Mother Teresa when you're just trying to make money. They did not see the threat because they didn't care. They were making money. And they thought that, no, what this does is it enables people to literally live in their own world, okay? You know, I have right-wing and left-wing friends who email me back and forth, two different universes. You know, if you want to believe that the Boogaloo movement and the right way, that this is the exact right way to look at the world, you can go to a place that will confirm every second of every day exactly everything you've believed. And then, well, it's like the guy who showed up at the pizza joint in Maryland. You know, that guy actually wasn't, well, I was going to say he wasn't crazy. If you show up with a gun at a pizza joint, you're crazy. But he wasn't one of the people that you would have quickly identified if you're walking through a town going, watch out for that guy. But this is what he watched. He saw the QAnon explain to him that Hillary Clinton was running a child pedophile ring out of this pizza place. And he was like, oh my God, I can't let that happen. So we have to figure out how to combat that, okay? How do you get into those ecospheres and undermine them? I don't have a great answer for that, okay? But that's where you got to get. Now, I mean, the one answer I will give you is something that I take from political campaigns, and that is never let your opponent occupy the space. It's always been, you know, if I don't care what it is, if my opponent's the only one who's got yard signs, if he's on, so sending out a message, we got to get in there. We got to get in there and we got to have our message in that space. So we got to figure out a way to get into these little things. And then you got to figure out what the message is. Okay. You know, because it's not easy. Okay. You go into that space, but you give a message that gets, you know, hit right back at you. That's where the research that Amy and others are doing is going to be so important. How do you get in there? So that's a big trend. We have got to find a way to get into these places where people are getting this information that is radicalizing them. And if they're radicalized, just ramping it up further. And the second big trend, I'll come back to my original point, is just the denigration of political institutions. And I have been on this. Look, I got elected, I beat two incumbents to get to where I'm at. And I remember the first time back in 1990 when I was running against a state senator, you know, it dawned on me that basically to the extent that people think that the way things are is terrible, that's good for me, okay? Because they're going to want change, all right? But I've watched members of Congress. There was just one who I really like, so I won't mention her name, but just had a big article talking about how, you know, they should reelect her because she's not really like most members of Congress. Okay, you know, yeah, the institution. Oh yeah, it's crap. It's terrible. You know, but hey, you know, I'm just there. You know, I'm just hanging out. I'm just, you know, don't take it out on me. We got to stop that. We just got it. You cannot continually run for office telling everybody that the place where you want to go to work is crap because you show up and you get the job. Oh, it's great. Oh, wait a second. You're mad at me now? No. It was them. It was that. No, you said the institution was terrible. And now you're going to go in there and try to use that institution? If there is a way to get to Republicans and Democrats and say, figure out a different way to win, okay? Figure out a way to get elected and represent your community without spending all that money and all that time telling them that the very institution ought to be burned to the ground. I mean, those are two trends that we have got to figure out a way to reverse.
Thank you, Congressman. And Mike Signer, your thoughts on trends?
Oh, well, thank you I have two thoughts following this. One is that the second part of the Communities Overcoming Extremism project that I talked about was a summit we did at Airbnb's headquarters in San Francisco, where we invited several dozen leaders at so-called mid-level tech companies, which I learned. I mean, I'm the general counsel of a company that has 550 employees. We're like a small company compared to mid-level companies, which are mid-level compared to the big five, which have thousands and thousands of employees. So mid-level companies like Airbnb, Pinterest, PayPal, Lyft have a tremendous range of choice and agency in front of them in how they deal with extremism. And we wanted to highlight the ones that are being more proactive. So Airbnb, we did it at their headquarters because they had taken this action to ban people from coming to the Unite the Right rally, and they'd been boycotted and attacked and so on. And we wanted to kind of celebrate and explore that kind of example. And it led us into this set of use cases like Patreon, Lyft, PayPal. There are a lot of these companies that are in this mid-level range that are not like, small Death Stars like Facebook and Instagram, which are like that big. And they have a tremendous, the ones who are deciding to be active players in the space, in the so-called trust and safety space, are having to wade into it on their own, and they view themselves as creators rather than market followers, and they are creating a world around them. And so Airbnb sees themselves like that. Patreon has done some tremendous interventions, and it was really interesting looking at what goes into creating a trust and safety program, because it's difficult, and a lot of it is crowdsourced. So you do have like a core of professionals who work at the company to try to stamp out and deplatform violent extremists. But some of it you have to rely on your users kind of surfacing things to you. So we did an interview with Pinterest head of trust and safety in the podcast that we did, which is called Overcoming Extremism, Ifeoma Azoma, and she talked about what had gone into that company deciding to embrace this as part of their brand and to hire people to do this and to ask their users to surface violent and extremist content. And it really requires a dedicated, proactive posture in the private sector as well as the public sector. And private sector companies are not subject to the First Amendment. They can create whatever universe they want to, and they can create an environment free of violent hate speech if they so desire. And we wanted to explore what it's like for them to do it. And I think that's where I wanted to end.
Thanks, Mike. I'm going to ask our other two panelists the same question, and if you want to pass, you're welcome to. But I'm going to start with Mohammed. Any thoughts on trends that worry you or trends that make you feel hopeful, Mohammed?
Briefly, I would just say, 95% of our individuals we work with have been radicalized online. 20 years ago, it was the historical Al-Qaeda. There was a courier network. Individuals interacted with individuals. So the game has totally been changed. I'm interested with, we've worked with all the big social media players and engaged with them, but I'm interested in what can we do that steps outside the box and thinking creatively, innovatively, blue sky, that works with, an individual all the way to Fortune 500 company. I don't know if we quite have that structure there yet. I'm being optimistic and hopeful, but I think we really need to actually listen to, even though I have to sit across individuals who have been radicalized and they have engaged in really bad activity. There's something that we need to extract from why they went down that pathway that can then inform what we're doing. There's a lot of smart people who've written about that, but I feel like a lot of it is a bit of an exercise. And so I might not have the answer for that, and that's okay. Maybe part of the answer is just going through the process for us to collectively figure this thing out. But what I would just say to you is that we have not solved this yet, and the government itself cannot be the sole solution, nor can technology firms be the sole solution as well. There's somewhere where there's a moving part like a bicycle. And as we've evolved in understanding how radicalization and mobilization works, we have to constantly pivot and see this as an iterative process. So I might not sound, I'm not giving you the silver bullet, but I think we really need to really push how we're viewing this, because otherwise we will see radicalization in another form, and the signs are always on the wall.
Thanks, Mohammed. I'm going to ask Amy to take that on. Quickly, I'm just going to remind folks, if you have a question you want to ask the panelists, just enter it into the Q&A function. And with that, Amy, if you want to take it away on what the trends that worry you or that you feel hopeful on.
I'm not sure there's much to add. I will just simply say social media is key here. Social media has become, in so many ways, the condemn of the 21st century. In some ways, this is quite literal. We saw KKK groups and other defendants in our suit use it to orchestrate their violence the same way that men in white hoods would meet in the woods 150 years ago to do the same. And instead of limiting that violence to a specific geographic area, it now has national and global reach because of social media. And so often the disinformation, the conspiracy theories, and the hate spread there turns into real world violence, as we've seen in Charlottesville and so many times afterwards. And I think many of the trends that are fueled by the rise of social media, like, for example, the use of car attack memes, which we saw in the Discord chats in July of 2017, a month before they went out and did it in Charlottesville, are on the rise, the same way as we've seen them in recent months before, for example, avowed KKK leaders plowed his car into a crowd of protesters in Richmond, Virginia. Similarly, the same sort of finger pointing that we saw after Charlottesville, trying to blame Antifa for violence that white supremacists orchestrated, is exactly what's happening now. And it's oftentimes fueled by the ability to amplify that message online. And at least in that case, by a DOJ and a federal government that only exacerbates, or rather a federal administration that only exacerbates the issue. And so understanding how social media has allowed this disinformation, these conspiracies, this hate to turn into real world violence much more broadly and much more quickly than it previously did. And also acknowledging that, to echo what the congressman said, never let your opponent occupy space, deplatforming works. Richard Spencer himself said it in court in our case. And so we should be occupying that space, but we should also be keeping up the pressure on these social media companies to ensure that they are not creating forums that simply give license to extremists to continue to spread their violence and their hate.
I know we're losing. Oh, go ahead, Mike.
I just wanted to say it's a little known fact that Charlottesville, as a microcosm or canary coal mine, however you think about it, we had this stuff too. So right after the Unite the Right rally happened, there was a conspiracy theory that spread rapidly that said that this was a concoction of George Soros, that because I had worked at the Center for American Progress, that we had hired crisis actors that were Jewish, that had staged this mass death, that had created this thing to lure in the right wing to be wailed on by Antifa. And it was very similar to the framing you're seeing in a lot of these cities right now. But it got to the level that Alex Jones did a whole show. Like, I talk about this in the book about me, where he said I should get the death penalty for killing Heather Heyer. And it was really astonishing to watch it metastasize and to see how unchecked it was, and how it would, and the number of bots and trolls that were picking it up and propagating it. And it was because the threat, I mean, I felt that it happened in large part because there was such a counter reaction to how Trump fit into this. And so many public figures were attacking Trump and Trumpism in connection to this flood of white nationalism. When Trump said that there was a counter push of misinformation to disinformation in reaction to it through these platforms. And in real time, it was beyond harrowing. It was like you couldn't believe what was happening. And now that has become kind of the rule rather than the exception now.
Thanks, Mike. And Congressman Smith, I know we're losing you any second now. Any final words before we lose you?
Yeah, I think it just building off of that, I think sort of what I think we really need to do is advance a moderate politics in America. Because in addition to all the problems we're talking about here, moderation has gotten a bad name on both the right and the left. And I could get into a long history, and I was very involved with DLC and the NDN, a lot of moderate groups that now a lot of Democrats are like, oh, that's, and look, I understand there were mistakes made there. I'm not saying we need to go back to that. I'm saying on both the right, there's no place in current politics for moderate politicians. In part, it's because of mistakes that moderates have made in the past. But whatever the reason, we need to create a space for that so that people have a place to go. Because right now, if you ask your average Republican about extremism, they'll be right there with you. You're absolutely right. Those, radical Islamists, those Antifa people, they're terrible. You ask a Democrat about extremism, they'll be right there with you. Oh, it's all the white nationals. No one sort of sees the broader extremist problem and has offered an alternative to it. We are still, by and large, using it for just short-term political advantage, whether Republican or Democrat. We have to see the broader threat and get past that short-term political advantage and try to build space for policies that will stop all the extremism that you all have talked about. So, incredibly important discussion. It was very beneficial to me to hear it. So I really appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you so much for your time, Congressman. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us.
Thanks.
So folks, I want to take a minute to go to the questions in the Q&A function. If you've not had the opportunity to enter your question into the Zoom Q&A function, go ahead and do that now. And I will start with the one that we have in there, but again, others feel free to enter in your question now. So I believe this question is for anyone who would like to answer. From Stephen, he says, in looking at the systemic nature of violent extremism, we often conceive of Islamist extremism as networked and right-wing or white nationalist extremism as at the hands of the lone wolf. Patrick Crusius, El Paso, Brenton Terrett, Dylan Roof, and others have each evidenced how broad, deep, and connected the networks of right-wing extremists are. So the question is, how can we contribute to reframing white nationalism as a transnational problem and thus one deserving of systemic attention, and chip away at some of the myths like that of the quote lone wolf, which people excuse as exceptions that are difficult to address? So that's the question. Any panelists who would like to take that on?
I'll start just because I literally wrote an op-ed on this exact topic last year, and it drives me insane. The term lone wolf drives me totally insane on this topic. And I wholeheartedly agree with the premise of the question, which is that, again, we can't address this challenge and this crisis if we're not recognizing the cycle under which this violence is happening and the ways in which they're entirely interconnected. I'm not sure if I mentioned this in my opening, but it is crystal clear to us in our work that there's a through line from so many of the white supremacist attacks a number of years ago, including Charlottesville, to the ones we're seeing in recent months. The Charlottesville leaders communicated on Gab with the Pittsburgh shooter before he killed 11 at Tree of Life. The Christchurch shooter, before killing dozens of Muslims praying in mosques in New Zealand, painted onto his gun a symbol popularized by one of our defendants, Matthew Heimbach. And then Christchurch, in turn, inspired Poway and El Paso. And so this is part of a cycle in which through these online forums, these hate groups, including a number of the ones we're taking on in this case, there's a very systemic and very robust infrastructure that inspires, fuels, and brings to action these attacks. And until we recognize that, until we start talking about it that way and addressing it systematically, we are never going to break that cycle. So I very much appreciate that question.
Any other panelists want to get it? Yeah, Mike, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I go into this in the book with some pretty specific anecdotes. There was, I see this as intentional and malfeasance at the federal level, because white nationalists were included in this. I mean, I really appreciated what the congressman had to say about not having our commentary flow toward an exclusively partisan end. And I think that there is, I mean, I've talked about the dangers across the spectrum, but with that said, the white nationalist extremist threat is particularly virulent. And this guy who worked at the State Department, and I talk about this in the book, I'd met him at a couple of CVE related events, and he told me at a meeting of the U.S. Conference of Mayors, he said, and he had been there in the Obama administration and through the Trump administration, he says, we have been told not to refer to the term white nationalist in our work on domestic extremism. And that was on top of what came out later with that. There was an incredible front cover New York Times magazine piece about what went wrong with dealing with white nationalism a year after Charlottesville by Janet Reitman, that did real investigative work to find out what's happening at the federal agencies. Why are they not targeting these terrorist groups with everything they have? And she basically uncovered it is because they have disincluded them because they're for political reasons. And it is, in 100 years, it's one of the most shocking things about this era, I think, that we'll look back on. ProPublica did an investigation too, where they were about what happened in Charlottesville, and they were interviewing former FBI agents. They were saying we should have had human intelligence units on these potential terrorists. We had lots of information of what they were up to in Charlottesville, and they weren't doing that because they had been guided to take the lens off of white nationalist groups for political reasons.
I'll just add two things real quick. One is, and amplify the point Amy and Mike mentioned, I mean, in terms of like lone wolf, I hate that terminology. It's like one of my, it makes me cringe because I'm like, what does that actually mean? We personally use like self-starters because, and I think we use the language self-starters, meaning there's always someone behind the scenes. There's always a friend, there's always a network, whether it's online or it's in person. And so, you know, I think collectively, I think we've all learned a lot in this space of terrorism prevention, CVE, PVE, et cetera. And so using self-starters is just something that we use just to try to sort of characterize what we mean in this context. Additionally, what I would say to you is that, you know, we on this topic dealing with what works, what doesn't work too as well. We have really struggled with trying to find ways to be PC, but not be PC. And I think as it relates to the issue of white supremacist issues in particular, I think historically, I mean, having been in government, I remember 2005 to 2016 when I was in government, when we dealt with radicalization, it was Islamists, and we had one person who was working on domestic extremists out of a team of 45. We saw what needed to get done. We knew what needed to take place. This particular analyst is still there, and he was advocating. And only now do we see the attention being raised. And so it should not be a political issue, but unfortunately, I think it goes to the broader issue of, and this is a separate topic, not worthwhile for now, but I think largely we've seen this being broadly something from the other and largely from individuals elsewhere outside of the United States. And then ultimately dealing with the broader issue of just when we talk about issues of slavery and America's original sin, which is again a separate topic, but I think that has also been part of it that's made people very uncomfortable to talk about, that I think we would have largely solved this if we were at least willing to speak it.
Thanks, Mohammed. We don't have a lot of time left. We do have 2 questions left. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to read both questions as quickly as I can, and then I'm going to ask our panelists if they have just lightning round, very brief answers to one or both of these questions. And so we won't take up too much time, but we will answer these questions. So the first one, again, abbreviating here, is U.S. government or groups like Communities Overcoming Extremism bringing experts together on the investigative side with expertise on how to investigate different types of paramilitary or extremist groups? And then the second question, what should we be doing now to mitigate the impact and prevent violence if President Trump uses confusion around the election to rally groups like those we've been discussing? So if you want to address either or both of those problems, please hop in now.
I'll take a swing at the second one, which will loop back to the first. I think it's more of a general answer that would become specific in each community. I think we need proactive, specific interventions to make this kind of violent activity beyond the pale, and you do that through everything that would be effective if you reverse engineered it back from effectiveness. So these militia lawsuits, I think that you need to disrupt, and the problem is because like the way that we're treating Russian interference, right? You see how divided the federal government is even on this. You see some intelligence agencies doing the right thing, then you see counter signaling from the White House, right? So you need concerted action to marginalize and disrupt potential violent or intimidating groups through every branch of government that will do it. And I think that means that there are some angles of the federal government that will do it. Then there are very active state agencies that will do it. And then there are cities that can do it. And you saw even in Virginia, Ralph Northam took this very venturesome action to prohibit weapons at this potentially very violent Second Amendment event from the Capitol grounds. The Virginia Supreme Court upheld him, and it made the event a lot safer. It was surprising that he was upheld. So you're seeing lots of interventions happening. Basically what I take is that this is a time to try and work. And the other thing that I want to add is it's allyship. The more robust your alliances at the community level, the stronger it is to otherize intimidating and organized violent groups, and the harder it is for them to argue that they have common cause. I mean, the neo-Confederate thing is no joke. And Trump, I mean, the whole goal there is to create a unified white nationalist theory, which worked in the Electoral College before. So this is a very real, vibrant strategy. But if it can be othernized and shown not to be a majority position through powerful alliances, you know, after the Tree of Life, the Pittsburgh Steelers put the Star of David on their pennant. Things like that can be very powerful when it shows that majority mainstream stakeholder institutions are together against organized political violence.
Any other panelists with just a really brief response to either of those questions? Mohammed or Amy?
I would just say, to echo what's been said, don't let this issue fall off the radar between now and the election. I think we need to look squarely in the eye the fact that we are dealing with a crisis of violent extremism in this country. It's so easy to forget that because the news cycle is such that the next time Trump tweets something crazy or the pandemic continues to grow or whatever it is, it falls through the cracks. And until the next attack happens, we forget that this is one of the most dire threats facing our country, our democracy, our national security. And I think we need a community of national security experts like Truman to continue raising the alarm between now and the election, especially, given the ways, as has been described, these issues intersect. And so don't let this fall off the radar. Continue to ring the alarm, continue to underscore that this is a very real crisis. And that is one way to at least make sure, no matter what happens in November, at least people are aware of what we're grappling with here, and we haven't ignored the issue altogether, as has so often been the case in recent years.
Thanks, Amy. I'm hearing that we need to have comprehensive solutions, we need to have proactive solutions, and they need to happen yesterday. I want to thank you all so much for your leadership in everything that you do every day. I want to thank you for taking your time today, and I want to let Mo Kalani, who had the foresight and the leadership to bring this event upon us and to lead it, to close us out for the day. And just let me say thank you to everyone who participated. Mo?
Awesome. Thank you, Ryan. This was an amazing panel. You know, I'm honored to have just been able to convene such a thing. Thank you all for joining us. To all the folks listening, I'm going to put in the chat the links to Dr. Mohammed Fraser Rahim's book, America's Other Muslims, and Mike Signer's book, Cry Havoc, as well as Integrity First for America's Facebook page and the page for the ADL. If you want to jot those down real quick, that would be very useful. Also, I would be remiss if I didn't mention the Truman Facebook page, but you can just look us up, Truman National Security Project. There's the Pacific Northwest chapter or the national Facebook page. Either way is fine. But thank you all for joining us, and have a wonderful Saturday. I think we'll leave this up for just a second so people can pick up the links. I'll give it a couple minutes, and that's really it. Thank you all for being here. This was great, and I hope that this work continues. Like Amy said, we have to make this conversation continue.
It's a great panel.
Thanks.
Thank you so much for joining. We'll leave this open for a sec so they can get the links.
Thank you, everybody. It was really an honor to be with you guys.
We got them.
More work to be done.
All right.
Guess we'll call it a
goodbye.
day.
We'll give you back your time.
Everyone.
See you later.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Thank you. Take care. Bye, Mom. Bye, me. Bye, Rob.